We hear a lot about the strength of China, about the rapid growth of its economy, and its rising importance in the world. Once a poorly developed agrarian country, dependent on imperialist states and destroyed by brutal civil war and occupation, today the People's Republic of China has become a powerful state. Modern China has the world's largest industry, advanced scientific and technical achievements, and the most numerous armies in the world. Chinese factories produce a lot of different things which are consumed by the rest of the world, and some companies' industries are almost fully situated in China. The labor of the Chinese workers is not only hard, but sometimes puts workers' lives in danger. Residents of Chinese provinces who manage to find a job in a city often become victims of arbitrariness and lawlessness, and even suicide, unable to withstand the frantic work pace at Chinese factories. Ensuring the growth of living standards that remain low and very uneven in China has been a long-lasting priority of the country's leadership. However, for whom do the workers at Chinese factories work, and can honest work really save them from lawlessness and poverty? In 1978, Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms were undertaken in China. They denoted the transition of the country's economy to a market economy system. As a political rival to the Soviet Union, Red China changed its colors. The new government made deals with Western investors on placement of foreign monopolies industries on its territory. The countries of the capitalist West willingly transferred their industries to China, where the cost of labor was minimal at that time. Forgetting the meaning behind its own name, the Chinese Communist Party paved the way for foreign capital that poured into the country, and actually rented out a sizable part of the working population of the country. Due to stratification in the countryside, socialist collective farms and villages were destroyed, and millions of people were ready to work in factories for a meager wage. In 2010, the number of unemployed in China was estimated at 200 million people. The number of Chinese workers has been increasing because of migration from poor villages. At the same time, the majority of the Chinese population works on family farms or lives in urban ghettos where their rights are often violated. State officials become capitalists who are appointed by party clans, and the developing socialist society turned into corrupt state capitalist society. In 2001, it was announced that the CPC would welcome entrepreneurs into its ranks. The number of workers and farmers in the National People's Congress decreased from 51.1% in 1975 to less than 4% in 2003. The stratification of Chinese society has amounted to great figures that are comparable to the most backward capitalist countries. China has recently moved ahead of the United States in terms of the number of dollar billionaires. Today, there are 819 dollar billionaires, and more than $1 million millionaires in China. In response to reproaches of the communists, Deng Xiaoping noticed that he was not interested in the color of the cat if it catches mice. The Chinese authority is not really interested in how they get their wealth, but the same can't be said about the working people. The profits of the overexploitation of Chinese workers go into the accounts of Western companies and large Chinese banks, in order to subsequently reinvest in the assets of monopolies of the capitalists. Meanwhile, the social sector of Chinese society, like in the rest of the world, is undergoing reforms and monetization. Any available services are rapidly being privatized, appropriated by growing financial capital, and turned into services. Chinese medicine and education, focused on making a profit, like the rest of the world, are not able to improve the quality of life of ordinary people. Not content with the hard work of its citizens alone, Chinese financial capital, with the support of the party, is introducing high-tech methods for tracking the working population. The system, called social credit, is designed to divide people into groups of respectable, solvent citizens and those who shirk away from work or are otherwise unreliable. Cities are covered by a network of cameras, bringing millions of faces to the police database. At factories, all kinds of control over workers' activities are used that tighten workers' schedules and fine for unacceptable rest. Chinese state corporations and banks don't only exploit their own citizens. The country is dependent on sales in markets in other countries and cannot develop within its own resources, unlike, for example, the Soviet Union. China is forced to export its capital to other countries, transfer industries, maintain the low cost of labor, or even seek cheaper ones when the maintenance of low labor costs becomes impossible. All these measures mean real imperialist expansion. The capitalists of the party bribe the bourgeoisie of less developed countries and support it in the fight against the workers. For example, in Kazakhstan, Chinese capital acquired the majority of oil and gas fields and actively helps the authorities to brutally suppress the strikes and actions of Kazakh oil industry workers. Chinese banks are not averse to bribing corrupt elites of weak and dependent countries and turning them into their debt colonies. The Chinese capitalists give loans to the countries of Asia and Africa for the construction of industrial factories, power plants, and other infrastructure. China uses the capacities of these factories to fulfill the needs of its own industry and even workplaces that are not occupied by the local citizens but by the Chinese, while the local bourgeoisie receives major bribes from its Chinese partners. The poor continue to live under the oppression of debt bondage and unemployment. Aiming at the maximum profit, Chinese capital does not stop depleting resources of neighboring countries and does not forget to cover it up with words about partnership and so-called joint ventures. The deforestation on Russian land by Chinese companies, together with greedy and disregarding governors, has already led the South Siberian and Transbaikal regions of Russia to environmental disaster. It is known that the policy of imperialist expansion is not limited to depleting resources and the forcing of economic dependence. China is preparing to defend possessive interests of its capitalists by armed force. A few years ago in Tajikistan, a whole region of the country was occupied by the Chinese army because of a debt for the credit forced by the Chinese and unpaid by the Tajik government. Along with mercenaries from the USA, Russia, and France, Chinese armed forces operate in African republics, appropriating valuable lands and mineral deposits. Among major territorial claims of the PRC are Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Russia, Japan, India, and Bhutan. Instead of establishing cells of the Communist International, the CPC establishes so-called Confucius Institutes, imposes traditional values everywhere instead of the ideas of proletarian struggle, and conducts national expansion instead of international assistance to workers of other countries. Yet despite capitalist restoration in China and disintegration in the Communist Party, the Chinese proletariat has impressive experience in fighting against capitalism in the past, and therefore there is hope for the future. The Chinese have long and selflessly led national liberation struggles. They fought robbery, economic dependence, and direct intervention of the imperialist powers. They created millions of peasant armies and Marxism-based cells that enlarged to the amount of thousands of workers' organizations in industrial centers. More than 30 years of civil war have taught them to fight against the bourgeoisie and nationalists, and this is more relevant today than ever. The crisis in the capitalist system revived the strike movement at Chinese factories. More than 1,000 major strikes and protests have occurred in the country over the past year, and the number of industrial disputes is growing. In 1993, there were only 8,000, and in 2012, more than 850,000. Workers at Chinese factories, transport workers, and builders, as well as displaced internal migrants, create committees for organized actions. Slow but steady, the largest group of the world's proletariat rises up, and it means that despite statements by reactionaries and party populists, the real color of China should be, and will be, red. Stay tuned.